Okay, this is an overview of conduct disorder, and um, I updated this to include some of the growing attention to a particular subtype called unemotional callous type, and also the various subtypes of conduct disorder that people are describing, and I'll also tell you why that's important. But let's begin. Here's a couple cases. This is a 6-year-old young man. Actually, he was a patient in our clinic, and we would always watch the mother pleading with him to sit still. He oftentimes would rummage through the drawers in the exam room. Mother would tell him to sit down, stop it. He wouldn't comply. He's already had I think he'd only been in school about 4 months, in kindergarten, mind you, and he'd already had 4 suspensions. He somehow got hold of matches, started a fire. He was seen dragging the family dog around with a rope around its neck. He beats on his older sisters. He's primarily in the care of his mother. His father is a long haul truck driver and usually is only home about every second weekend. A 15-year-old young woman. She recently assaulted her teacher. She's actually also had a number of school suspensions for carrying a knife, stealing money out of teacher's desk, and got caught smoking marijuana. She does not have a very good relationship with her mother. It's very conflictual. She'll take off and be gone overnight, maybe 2 nights. The father has been incarcerated for auto theft, and the mother works about 50 plus hours a week, so this young woman is oftentimes unsupervised. Here are some more extreme versions. This is a young woman named Alyssa Bustamante. I think she's 16. And she deliberately killed a young child, probably about 5 or 6. And here's what she says about the experience. I don't know how to feel. It was amazing. Amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. And she's talking again about killing a child. And there are pictures of her uh, after her arrest and I guess before her arrest. So conduct disorder is what we usually think about when we think about juvenile delinquency. Okay? And the symptoms or behaviors fall into these 4 categories: aggression or threatening harm to people or animals, getting into physical fights, pulling a knife on somebody. I had a girl who had killed a puppy by repeatedly throwing it against the wall. Deliberate property damage or destruction. This includes fire setting, as well as vandalism. For example, an unoccupied house, they might throw rocks through the windows, break the windows. Violations of rules. This can be things like truancy or not keeping curfew. And then persistent lying. This is not white lies to preserve somebody's feelings. This is to avoid the consequences for doing something like stealing or lying about not attending school, those kinds of things. So these are the 4 basic clusters of symptoms. And this is a little more detail. Um, Actually, the last one should say has forced someone into sexual activity. Um, Stealing shoplifting, where you're not dealing directly with a victim, usually is not associated with the same level of disturbance that threatening somebody with a knife is. Just to give you some idea, this is a graph of cruelty to animals by age. That's a percentage. Now, the top one is boys referred for mental health services, so that's a fairly select group. And you can see it peaks at younger ages. Then we look at girls referred for mental health services, then kids, then boys not referred, and girls not referred. So again, in situations where a child is presenting a mental health clinic, um, this is behavior that you want to query about, you want to ask about. Property destruction. This is setting fires for the sake of watching stuff burn. Okay, setting fires in dumpsters, stuff like that. Destroying somebody else's property. Um, for example, taking the teacher's coffee mug and deliberately breaking it. Breaking into homes and lying to obtain goods or to avoid obligations. Okay, that would be again. Um, I really was sick. You can't have me in the Saturday study hall for skipping school. I really was sick. I really was sick. I just lost the doctor's note. And non-trivial value, that's kind of interesting. Um, Usually the cut point for non-trivial is $20, something worth $20 or more. And this has always led me, I've interviewed a lot of kids with this condition, led to some interesting conversations. For example, a kid, I'm asked him if they've stolen stuff. And they said, yeah, I've stolen some DVDs from Walmart. Are they going to meet the $20 cutoff here? Well, were those new releases? Did you get them out of the bargain bin where they were $3.99? I mean, I think it's important that we operationalize these things, but sometimes it gets a little humorous. This is both cruelty to animals and vandalism by age and gender. Um, the cruelty to animals is up on top, and the vandalism is down below. And again, kids referred for mental health treatment, particularly boys, are more likely to engage in both. This is a relatively common problem that leads to mental health referrals. The other issue is that the juvenile courts historically have been more rehabilitation oriented than punishment oriented, although that's changing somewhat. And because of that, a lot of them hire psychologists. A lot of the guys I went to grad school with are working as psychologists for the juvenile courts. And the courts believed once upon a time that psychological evaluations, understanding the underlying motivation for these kids' juvenile acts, and sending them for counseling was going to be more helpful than long-term stays in detention. I'll tell you, the research didn't consistently show that that was the case. Arson, particularly juvenile arson, is not uncommon. Lying, I think we've talked about this. Here's some examples. Sometimes the stories that you get are really quite elaborate, and they'll use deception to obtain money, basically saying, I've got a doctor's appointment today, and there's a $30 copay, so could you give me 30 bucks? And of course, that does not go to the doctor's appointment. They haven't been known to forge signatures on both on school report cards, but also things like checks. Violation of the rules, um, staying out at night, particularly overnight where a parent doesn't know where they are, running away from home, that you have to do that twice. I don't know why they came up with twice, while living in a parental home, and or once and you're gone for a lengthy period. I'm not sure what that is, probably about a week. Um, this is not, you know, I'm staying overnight at a friend's house, and me and my friend actually went to somebody else's house during that time, like a guy's house. It's not that kind of stuff. It is basically they're gone and the parent doesn't know their whereabouts. So, like all of these conditions, you have to have a certain number of symptoms. Here, you've got to have 3 that have been persistently present for about 12 months, and one of these must be there in the past 6 months. Now, I'm going to stop for just a minute because this is important because I think it separates conduct disorder from kids who engage in things like minor shoplifting, minor drinking, stuff like that, from conduct disorder. Typically, with kids who are experimenting, so to speak, um, the pattern is not persistent. They do it a couple times and that's it. How common is this? Well, depends how you define it. Some figures are pretty high. I've seen 10 to 12%. For example, there was a famous study that was done at a parochial high school, I think it's Catholic high school, and it was a boys' school, and they asked questions that could be answered anonymously. And a very high percentage of those kids had consumed alcohol and also had engaged in something like shoplifting um, as well. And the percentage, I think, was at least 30% of these guys had reportedly done that. Again, it's not a consistent pattern. And so that's why it usually doesn't rise to the level of conduct disorder. I've seen figures as high as 9.5% for lifetime prevalence in the US. Given that this is a condition of children and that it has to occur by probably about the age of 17 or 18, this is pretty striking. You'll see that it's more common in males than females, and we'll talk about that some more. In clinical settings, as like an outpatient mental health setting, you can see it's a fairly reasonably common problem. In detention centers, like prisons in many respects, the percentage is very, very high because that's why they're in detention. Okay, subtyping. Now, the situation here is that they've looked at different characteristics, both demographics of kids, types of offenses, personality characteristics, and also comorbid conditions, particularly ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, are very, very common among kids with conduct disorder. And when there are more diagnoses on top of conduct disorder, the outcome is likely to be worse. Okay? Why do we ruminate about this? Well, first of all, conduct disorder has had a pretty negative rap. And historically, we tend to view kids with conduct disorder as beyond help. Okay? Um, and I have evaluated a number of teenagers who have this, and one of the most striking things is I'll do the interview and they'll tell me about stealing stuff, breaking into cars, stabbing somebody, um, running away and being gone for a couple days. And at the end of it, I'll say, this is probably troubling to your parents, but how how troubling is it to you? Do you see this as a problem? And they don't. They don't at all. And that's one of the challenges working with kids with this condition. And should you invest in treatment? And if you should invest in treatment, are there particular kids who are more likely to benefit from it than others? Okay. Um, and the issue is interesting. I mean, if you had limited resources for treatment, would you target the kids who are most severe and pose the greatest threat to public safety? Or would you target kids in early stages where they haven't had as much of a long time pattern of this kind of behavior, with the likelihood that you may be able to prevent it from getting worse? Um, this is the male-female ratio. And the DSM has used this distinction between child onset under the age of 10 and adolescent onset over the age of 10. And you can see that boys are more likely to be in the first group, but it's pretty equal for adolescent onset. So this is an example of what I was just talking about. You've got a 6-year-old guy who's been setting fires, cruelty to animals, tried to suffocate his baby sister with a quilt, doesn't have any remorse. One of the more distressing cases I had was of a kid about this age who fed a kitten to a pit bull and came into the kitchen waving this bloody cat head at his mother. So you've got kids like that. And then you have kids where they have later onset and some other characteristics that may suggest a better outcome. This is a 15-year-old girl. She'd been functioning very well until about a year or so. Her grades were great. She had a lot of friends, involved in sports, extracurriculars. Her parents got a divorce about a year and a half ago. 6 months after that, she was picked up for some shoplifting. She's been skipping classes. She's out. She comes home at night, but she's out past curfew, and she has been caught with alcohol. Who is more likely to have a better outcome? Well, I probably say that the girl is, although you could make a case that here's a kid who's 6 years old. If you really get in there, really work hard to structure the environment and reinforce appropriate behavior, you may prevent it from getting worse. Um, we've already talked about most of these things. Again, like all of these conditions, they have to create clinically significant life impairment. And the child or adolescent is not going to see that they have life impairment. Other people, their teachers, parents, etc., are. Also, as I was just alluding to, not all behaviors named in that list should be evidence that the child has conduct disorder because, again, many kids do illegal stuff. Drinking, staying out past curfew, skipping school. Remember I don't know if they still have it, the senior skip days that they would often have in high school. I will have to confess that I participated in one with my girlfriend at the time. Um, does this mean that you are on the road to delinquency and more serious criminal behavior? Probably not. When should you diagnose this? Um, you may see this pattern of behavior at 4.5 to 5, and probably one of the more significant predictors of later conduct disorder is aggressive behavior. Now, some aggressive behavior is normal in preschool kids, but around age 4, it should be dropping off. And if it's not, if it escalates or remains the same, then it should be concerned. We talk about intentional acts, and sometimes we use the word instrumental acts. Intentionality is probably not present at 6 or 7 years old, like the kid who fed the kitten to the pit bull. It's probably much more impulsive. However, as kids get older, if you want to get back at somebody, for example, for adolescent girls, the most common form of bullying is not physical threats or physical assault, but starting rumors. That is intentional. Okay? It's not impulsive. It's done with some degree of planfulness. Here is why we want to be concerned. At least 50% of kids with conduct disorder have what's called antisocial personality in adulthood. Now, I want to be very, very clear about this, and this comes up in my adult psychopathology class a lot. Antisocial does not mean I don't like to be with people. Antisocial means you don't conform to social rules, norms, and laws. So again, if you want to see a large number of people with this condition, visit a penitentiary. Now, there are some aspects, if they are present in childhood, make it more likely that you're going to develop antisocial personality as an adult. We're going to talk about callousness, substance use, and presence of other conditions like ADHD. And this is age information. The diagnosis in preschool is not real stable. It's not real reliable. A lot of behavior resolves on its own. So it's another reason people are reluctant to diagnose. And again, this is kind of a stigmatizing diagnosis when it's given. Unless there are situational factors, parental divorce, a parent dies, things like that, and the behaviors associated with those traumatic family events, this early onset conduct disorder has a poor prognosis, particularly if there's cruelty to animals, particularly if there's fire setting. The adolescent outcome typically has a better, adolescent onset has a better outcome. The problem behaviors are usually of briefer duration, and they don't have the bizarre quality that you often will see with young kids. So this is a little chart showing what happens over the life course. Early childhood is low. In early adolescence, 12, 13 to 15 is its highest, and then later adolescence, there's some natural decline. These are crime statistics by age, and I know this one's probably a little tough to read, but you'll see that the jump begins before age 18 with both property crimes and violent crimes. And then you'll notice that usually by the 30s, it's declining. Many people have talked about antisocial personality burnout in the 40s, and it's argued that they may not have the energy to be as impulsive as they once were. Also, clinically, there's descriptions of people who've had long histories of antisocial behavior who oftentimes, when they're incarcerated, they'll kind of look at their lives and say, man, I have really screwed up, and this is really not a way that I want to live, and can make a change. We call this sort of a window of change for antisocial personalities. I will tell you that is not an evidence-based perspective. It's much more one that it's clinically oriented. Okay, girls. Girls, as a general rule, have better outcomes. They usually don't start with more serious behavior until they're teens. They're usually, as I said before, less physically aggressive. They engage in more relational aggression. They're more likely to have what the court system calls status offenses. Status offenses are, you want to call them crimes, things that would be crimes if you're a minor, but not if you're over 18. You know, we can stay out as adults till all hours, and it's not illegal. Um, we can consume alcohol, and it's not illegal. Um, we can skip classes and not go to school, and there's no consequence. However, if you're under 16, there is. That's why those things are called status offenses. Girls are less likely to have comorbid problems, less likely to have learning disabilities, which are relatively common among kids with conduct disorder. And they haven't had it as long. However, one risk factor is early menarche. Girls who go through puberty early, particularly if they are in a co-ed school. And that is what this is showing. That conduct disordered behaviors, the far left where you see the dark bar, those are girls who undergo puberty early. However, if you are in an all-girls school, it's somewhat less likely that you will have behavior problems, particularly early on. This is an expensive condition. I'm sorry, this chart is a little low. I'm sorry, a little difficult to read, but basically, it's been estimated that these kids can cost about $60,000 a year, particularly if they're in a detention facility. And incidentally, we are not alone. This also occurs in the United Kingdom. And again, it's fairly costly. So it's a big public health issue. Okay, subtyping. I think we've already talked about the early onset type. One we haven't talked about, and we don't really use this term as much anymore, it's called socialized conduct disorder. These are usually kids who engage in illegal behavior, but it's part of a social group, like gangs. Gang members oftentimes do have emotional attachments. In many respects, the gang is kind of an alternate family, and they do have loyalties. And on psychological testing, if you compare those kids with somebody who had or conduct disordered behavior had its onset at around 6 or 7, they're now 14. Gang members are less psychologically disturbed. And what has been found is if you can take them out of the gang milieu, they oftentimes will do significantly better. I'm going to show you a bunch of these, and I'm not trying to make you commit all these details to memory, but I just want to show you the ways that they've divided this up. This is pretty straightforward from the categories from the DSM-5. So they look at property violations, covert actions. Covert actions are things that are like shoplifting or being out past curfew, where there's no direct harm done to anybody else. Aggressive behavior, again, is a category by itself. And then the fourth one is oppositional behavior. Oppositional behavior by itself does not include illegal behavior, but it includes defiance and being highly argumentative. And we'll talk more about oppositional defiant disorder, probably best thought of as significant tantrums and refusal to follow reasonable requests. ODD, in many cases, is probably a precursor to conduct disorder. So you may have oppositional defiant disorder in early childhood. In late childhood, it grades into conduct disorder. This again is another typology, and it may be also a little difficult to read. I apologize. Again, we're looking at violent physical aggression on the left-hand side. Not as much physical aggression and fewer illegal acts on the right-hand side. And then the triangle that's sort of towards the middle, again, is dealing with oppositional behavior, resistance to authority, things like that. So all three of these have been shown to lead to delinquency. Now, this is what's kind of new on the horizon. The DSM-5 added another specifier. So specifiers that we had were adolescent onset, childhood onset, sometimes mild, moderate, severe in terms of the symptoms. But one of the things that has really struck people is this sort of lack of remorse and this callousness, inability to empathize with others, viewing others as basically a thing rather than a human being, having very little sensitivity to others' feelings, and their aggressive behaviors tend to be more severe. The old term for this is psychopathy, psychopath. Not all adults with antisocial personality are psychopathic. Okay? Psychopathy is like a subgroup within antisocial, and it's a subgroup within conduct disorder. Incidentally, and I think this will come up again, but I'll say it here, to get a diagnosis of antisocial personality in adulthood, you must meet criteria for conduct disorder by the age of 15. Okay, that's one of the criteria. So again, it means fairly long-standing. So this is one of the things I wanted to point out. You see in the middle, we have a couple courses. Oppositional defiant disorder becomes conduct disorder in later childhood, and then antisocial personality in adulthood. ADHD, you can see that ADHD oftentimes coexists with conduct disorder, and the oppositional defiant disorder may in some instances coexist with childhood depression, which may lead to substance use problems. But again, if you have serious substance use issues, the likelihood that you've engaged in some other conduct disordered behavior is relatively high. And again, probably what is most, again, useful to think about is that there are kids who don't seem to have significant problems in childhood, but in adolescence, probably in part because of peer influences, that's when the conduct disordered behavior begins. Okay, this is probably a little out of whack. This is the outcome of conduct disorder for about 50% of kids who have it. And as I said before, if you've got oppositional defiant disorder on top of it and ADHD on top of it, the likelihood you're going to meet these criteria is much higher. And you can see that you have to have the criteria for conduct disorder and then 3 of the following similar kinds of characteristics. Does include things like irresponsibility, quitting a job without a job to go to, not paying child support, stuff like that, and a lack of remorse, not feeling any sort of sense of guilt over having harmed somebody. Okay, so what has happened is that, and I put psychopathy in quotes here deliberately, because this is a term that we used to use with adults. People who've been studying psychopathic subtypes of conduct disorder have come up with these 3 categories. And these seem to be traits, so fairly stable personality characteristics. I know this is a killer of a slide, but what I'm really just trying to show you here is that this is a subtype or subgroup of conduct disordered kids. They use the lying criteria as sort of a cut point to then talk about these subgroups. So you have to meet criteria for conduct disorder, but in addition to meeting the criteria for conduct disorder, you may be classified into one of these 3 groups. And again, they use this old term, psychopathy, that we don't really use much anymore. So here's one of the types, the grandiose type. This is based upon an interesting older view of antisocial personality. A guy named Hervé Cleckley, a psychiatrist from Canada, wrote a famous book called The Mask of Sanity. And he talked about how these guys are charming. They can sell you worthless stock. The guy who sold you that used car and the transmission fell out 2 weeks later, and when you went back to the car lot, he seemed to have amnesia for you. They tend to view themselves as special or important, and most of us, from their perspective, are jerks. Okay. One of the Columbine shooters, and this is a little dated, they got a hold of his diary, and one of the things he wrote about was stealing a woman's purse and basically blamed her for it. You left your purse on the front seat. How stupid can anybody be to do that? You deserve to have it stolen. And so these are usually people who are, as adults, are pretty good at things like sales. Some would say that they may be successful in politics. They're great at making up interesting stories, particularly to account for some of their behavior. This is the classic callous type. no remorse. They don't experience much affect. Is the outward expression of emotion. It's not what you report. It's their outward smiling, frowning, stuff like that. They don't show much of it. They cannot empathize with others, and they're really don't care. So you're flunking school. Yeah, so what? It's for jerks. Okay? You quit your job. You didn't have one to go to. Yeah, that person was a jerk too. I'll get a job. I'll get another job. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the second installment here, and this is just to sort of orient you. There is growing neuropsychological research looking at brain activity, particularly with this callous subtype, and I thought I might throw this in here. One of the things that's interesting, if you know, remember your basic neuroscience, the amygdala is involved in emotional reactions, the fight or flight response, anxiety, things like that. Kids with conduct disorder, particularly this callous type, don't seem to show the normal level of activity with the amygdala. Um, and if they're shown pictures of somebody hurt or somebody in a very, very bad situation, like a homeless person, they don't show the response that non-conduct disordered kids would. So you have the daring impulsive type, and this is one characteristic, again, of antisocial personality, where you are impulsive. You decide tonight it's time to take a road trip to California. Throw some stuff in the car and take off. Um, despite despite the fact that you've got school and some obligations to other people. This is very true in terms of relationships. These folks cannot maintain relationships for an extended period of time. They are not monogamous folks. And they do engage in what's called sensation-seeking behavior. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting here. Number one is they've shown that with adults at least, they don't show normal levels of anxiety. Therefore, they don't seem to be deterred by the possibility of going to prison. Now, I've interviewed folks, again, like this in this situation. And, if I was going to begin my prison sentence, it was going to be 5, 10, 20 years in the next 6 weeks, I'd be an emotional mess. These guys could be talking about the weather or last night's basketball game. Yeah, it's just part of life. Um, they've also found that to get a normal level of arousal, normal increase in heart rate, normal increase in activity in the reticular activating system within the brain, these folks require a stronger stimulus. So, a car backfiring loudly will startle us. Not that. Okay? It takes something much stronger for them to show the autonomic nervous system response to things that would be considered uh, threatening, frightening, or just stimulating. Okay, I've been talking about comorbidity. Let me just show you that the rates of comorbidity are pretty high. ODD, we just talked about it, and we're going to talk about some more. And ADHD, actually, the majority of kids with ODD have ADHD. Conduct disorder is pretty common, and you can see some of the other conditions. Um, the ADHD combination, ADHD and CD, particularly if the ADHD is untreated, um, is a bad prognostic indicator. It's associated with greater aggression in adolescence as well as in adulthood. And this is a developmental trajectory. So what we're talking about here is at a very young age, the kid may show hyperactivity and inattention. Once they start school, they may demonstrate oppositional behaviors and being argumentative, and they're not going to do well academically. Then it grades into conduct disorder in adolescence, as well as into antisocial personality in adulthood. So I lay this out because this is a common trajectory. We're going to talk more about this later, but again, a lot of the action in research these days has been on brain structure and function associated with many mental health problems. It's interesting that, again, these folks have a smaller amygdala, and the frontal areas and the prefrontal areas of the brain, which are involved in things like self-monitoring, emotional regulation, impulse control. These regions seem to be smaller, or they are not connected as well with other regions of the brain. And this is a sort of summary chart showing you, again, the risk factors begin during pregnancy and continue on into early childhood. Family interaction factors play a role, again, particularly if there are parents who have antisocial personality. And so this is a good example of a condition in which there is a genetic predisposition. It's not huge. It may be about 15% at the most. And that interacts with the environment. And that is it.